You step out of a store, your arms loaded with bags, your mind occupied with trivial thoughts. What's for dinner tonight? Will you beat the rush hour traffic? The hum of everyday life surrounds you, cars honking, conversations drifting in the air, a child's laughter. And then, in a single deafening instant, everything changes. There's no warning, no time to react. One moment, you're standing under the open sky. The next, chaos erupts. Imagine the questions racing through your mind. Was that a firecracker? Why are people screaming? Why is there blood on the pavement? You didn't see a shooter. You didn't hear a car speed away. It feels like the very air has turned hostile. You're left grappling with the impossible. How does someone vanish into thin air after an attack so precise, so untraceable? This was the grim reality for residents of the Washington, D.C. area in October 2002. Over a span of 23 days, life in the bustling metropolitan region transformed into a waking nightmare. Streets that once bustled with life now echoed with fear. Parents hurried their children indoors before dusk. Shoppers scanned parking lots with growing paranoia. Even mundane tasks like filling up at a gas station became acts of courage. Every shadow seemed suspicious. Every sound made you jump. No one felt safe. Who could have done this? What kind of person targets random, innocent people, killing without pattern or warning? And how could they evade capture with such chilling ease? The DC sniper attacks didn't just take lives. They unraveled the fabric of an entire community, leaving millions haunted by the same burning question: why? The terror began without fanfare, with a single shot fired in a quiet suburban parking lot. To those who heard about it, it seemed like an isolated tragedy, just another headline. But within 24 hours, the truth became chillingly clear. This was no one-off incident. It was calculated, and whoever was behind it wasn't done. Day after day, the body count rose. It didn't matter who you were. A man walking to his car, a mother running errands, a child playing outside. No one was immune. The randomness of the victims made the attacks all the more terrifying. There was no discernible motive, no connection between those who died. It wasn't about revenge or a personal vendetta. It was something darker, something that defied logic and left an entire region on edge. People asked themselves, "Am I next?" Law enforcement scrambled to find answers. Hundreds of officers and agents pored over evidence, followed leads, and tried to make sense of the seemingly senseless. But the killers always seemed to be one step ahead, leaving behind cryptic messages that only deepened the mystery. Each day brought new fear, new questions, and no resolution. This story isn't just about the terror that gripped a region. It's about the resilience of the people who lived through it and the relentless pursuit of justice by those sworn to protect them. It's about the power of fear and the strength it takes to face it. Most of all, it's about uncovering the truth behind one of the most harrowing and enigmatic crime sprees. Who were the men behind the scope? How did they plan their reign of terror? And what drove them to target strangers with such cold precision? Stay with us as we unravel the twisted motives, relentless investigation, and eventual downfall of the DC snipers. A story that will haunt you long after the final shot is fired. It started like a single crack in an otherwise perfect glass. Small, unexpected, seemingly manageable. On October 2, 2002, in the quiet suburb of Montgomery County, Maryland, James Martin, a 55-year-old man, was shot and killed in the parking lot of a grocery store. There were no screams, no frantic calls for help from witnesses, no signs of an altercation. Just one sharp, echoing gunshot that shattered the peaceful evening and ended a life. At first, the incident was treated as a tragedy, but not a mystery. A robbery gone wrong, perhaps, or a personal vendetta taken too far. The locals, though saddened, returned to their routines, clutching the belief that the violence was an isolated anomaly. But the next day, that fragile belief was obliterated. The dawn of October 3 brought more death, 4 lives snuffed out in different parts of Montgomery County. In the span of mere hours, the community was thrown into chaos. The randomness of it all was the most unsettling aspect. A man mowing his lawn, a woman reading a book at a bus stop, a middle-aged father pumping gas, a young mother walking to her car. 4 different people, in 4 different locations, united only by the sudden, inexplicable violence that ended their lives. The randomness made the killings feel unstoppable. It could have been anyone, your neighbor, your friend, your loved one. The streets that had always felt safe now seemed like a battleground. Doors were locked earlier, errands postponed, and eyes darted nervously over shoulders. Who was behind this? And why? As news outlets began to piece together the events, the community's fear turned to panic. The word "spree killer" was whispered in hushed tones, while others speculated about gang violence or a string of unrelated incidents. Yet, nothing about these murders fit neatly into a category. There were no witnesses, no threats, no claims of responsibility. Just cold, calculated death. Then came the first real clue. A detail so chilling it made even seasoned investigators pause. Ballistics reports confirmed that the same weapon had been used in all 5 murders. These weren't random, unconnected acts of violence. They were part of something much darker. The FBI was called in to assist local law enforcement, and the manhunt began in earnest. Theories multiplied as investigators tried to make sense of the carnage. Was it one person or a group? Were they stationary or mobile? And most haunting of all, when and where would they strike next? The killers, however, had no intention of being predictable. While officers canvassed neighborhoods, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed security footage, the perpetrators slipped away unnoticed. They moved with precision and struck with devastating efficiency. Each day brought new horror as the body count continued to rise, leaving law enforcement and civilians alike grappling with an unsettling truth. No one was safe. It wasn't until later that the full extent of their plan would come to light. The killers weren't operating on foot or from a crowded city block. They had created something far more insidious. The weapon of terror wasn't just the rifle, it was the vehicle itself. A 1990 Chevrolet Caprice had been transformed into a mobile death machine, complete with a sniper's nest in the trunk. From this hidden vantage point, the gunman could fire with deadly accuracy while remaining virtually invisible. This revelation added an entirely new layer of fear to an already panicked community. Suddenly, every passing car felt like a potential threat. The Caprice could be anywhere, its ominous presence a needle in a haystack of traffic. Police checkpoints sprang up across the region, cars were pulled over en masse, and drivers grew accustomed to seeing flashing lights in their rearview mirrors. But the killers remained elusive, their trail as cold as their hearts. As the days wore on, the growing number of victims painted a grim picture. The people behind the trigger weren't just killers, they were hunters. Their targets were random, their methods deliberate. Each shot was a message, though no one yet understood what it meant. But one thing was clear. This was only the beginning, and so the community watched and waited, bracing for the next crack in the glass. The fear was no longer confined to a single community. It spread like wildfire, igniting paranoia across the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area and beyond. What began as a series of isolated, horrifying murders was now evolving into a reign of terror that seemed unstoppable. Families debated whether to send their children to school. People ran errands in hurried bursts, avoiding eye contact with strangers and scanning rooftops for signs of a threat they couldn't identify. The simple act of pumping gas, a mundane, routine task, transformed into a ritual of fear, with drivers crouching behind their vehicles, eyes darting nervously in all directions. And then, on October 14, 2002, the terror struck even closer to home for those who had vowed to bring the killers to justice. Linda Franklin, a 47-year-old FBI intelligence analyst, had dedicated her life to understanding threats and protecting the nation. But on that crisp October evening, as she walked to her car in the parking lot of a Home Depot in Falls Church, Virginia, she became the sniper's next target. With her husband by her side, just feet away, Linda's life was stolen by a single unerring shot. It was a devastating blow, not just for her family, but for the entire FBI. Until then, the murders had felt random, detached, an attack on the public at large. But Linda's death made it personal. One of their own had fallen. The weight of this tragedy bore down on her colleagues, adding a deeply emotional dimension to an already immense pressure. Investigators, already working around the clock, redoubled their efforts. Every shred of evidence, every phone call, every fleeting lead was examined with microscopic precision. The need for answers became desperate, but answers were hard to come by. The killers, it seemed, had mastered the art of invisibility. Witnesses were few and far between, and those who did come forward offered little more than fragments. A fleeting glimpse of a shadowy figure, a sound they couldn't quite place, or a flash of movement they weren't even sure they had seen. Each clue seemed to lead to a dead end, and with every passing day, the killers grew bolder. The death of Linda Franklin was particularly haunting because of its precision. The sniper had struck in a busy parking lot, a place swarming with potential witnesses. Yet, just like before, there was no definitive sighting, no immediate pursuit. It was as if the killers had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the heartbreak and horror of their latest crime. For Linda's husband, the scene was a waking nightmare. One moment they were discussing what to do next. Maybe dinner plans, maybe something as mundane as the week's groceries. The next, she was on the ground, her life extinguished in an instant. The grief and helplessness he felt were immeasurable. He had been so close, yet utterly powerless to stop it. The public's unease deepened. If the killers could strike someone like Linda, an FBI analyst trained to recognize danger, what chance did an ordinary person have? The randomness of it all continued to terrify. Men, women, young, old, no one was safe. And now, it seemed, even the places people thought were most secure were potential targets. Investigators began to suspect that the killers were taunting them. The precision of the attacks, the careful planning, the lack of any clear pattern, all of it suggested a calculated effort to sow fear and confusion. And then there were the messages. Cryptic notes and clues left behind at crime scenes hinted at a twisted game the killers were playing. At one site, a tarot card was discovered. The death card, chillingly marked with the words, "Call me God." It was a clear statement of their arrogance, their belief that they were untouchable. As the days turned into weeks, the death toll continued to climb. Each new murder brought fresh anguish to the families of the victims and deepened the community's sense of vulnerability. Gas stations, parking lots, schoolyards, all the places where people once felt safe were now potential killing grounds. The psychological toll was immense. Parents kept their children inside, businesses saw fewer customers, and streets that were once bustling with life now felt eerily deserted. Still, the killers moved among them, unseen but omnipresent. Their weapon was not just the rifle, but also the pervasive fear that gripped the region. The Chevrolet Caprice, their mobile fortress, became the stuff of nightmares. But no one could find it, no matter how many vehicles were stopped and searched. The hunters remained one step ahead, their motives as inscrutable as their methods. And so, the nation watched in collective horror, waiting for the next shot, the next tragedy. Each passing day felt like borrowed time, every new murder another cruel reminder that the killers were still out there, watching, waiting, and ready to strike. The tension was unbearable, and the question loomed over everyone: how many more lives would be lost before the nightmare ended? The investigators knew they were racing against time. Every piece of evidence, no matter how small, was a potential lifeline. The weight of the nation's hope rested on their shoulders, and failure was not an option. But with each day that the killers evaded capture, the path forward grew darker, the stakes higher. The chase was intensifying, and the endgame, whatever it would be, was drawing nearer. The tension in the air was electric. Each day felt heavier than the last as the killers continued their deadly spree. Every time the nation thought the worst had passed, another shot rang out, another life was stolen, and another community was left in shock and mourning. The weight of uncertainty crushed even the most resolute spirits, leaving millions to wonder when, if ever, this nightmare would end. The killers weren't just striking fear into the hearts of the public. They were playing a sinister game with law enforcement. The discovery of the death tarot card at a crime scene was the first unmistakable sign of their twisted sense of control. The words scrawled across it, "Call me God," were more than a taunt. They were a declaration of power, a chilling proclamation that the killers saw themselves as omnipotent beings, deciding who lived and who died. The sheer arrogance of it was infuriating and terrifying in equal measure. The FBI, already under immense pressure, now found themselves in a psychological battle as well as a criminal one. The killers seemed to be taunting them at every turn. Then came the demands. A staggering $10 million ransom, delivered in messages that were clumsily written, yet deliberate in tone. It was clear the killers were confident, even brazen, in their belief that they could outwit law enforcement. The notes revealed glimpses into their mindset, but nothing concrete enough to identify them. While investigators combed through the messages for clues, they also had to contend with a flood of tips from the public. One recurring report, a white box truck seen near several crime scenes, appeared to be a promising lead. The FBI acted swiftly, issuing an alert for the vehicle and dedicating countless hours to tracking it down. For days, officers stopped and searched every white box truck they could find, only to come up empty-handed each time. Frustration mounted, and with every dead end the killers gained a little more confidence. Meanwhile, the Chevrolet Caprice remained invisible, a ghost in the sprawling labyrinth of roads and highways. Unassuming and easily overlooked, it blended into the background, its true nature hidden from even the most vigilant eyes. Inside the vehicle, the killers moved with chilling precision, their every action calculated to. The FBI knew they were being toyed with, and the psychological toll on the investigators was enormous. Every failure, every misstep weighed heavily on the team. The killers seemed to anticipate their moves, staying one step ahead at all times. It was a game of cat and mouse, but the hunters and the hunted seemed to trade places with every passing day. As the investigation intensified, law enforcement agencies across the country were brought in to assist. Federal, state, and local officers worked together in an unprecedented show of coordination. Yet, despite their combined efforts, the killers continued to elude capture. Each passing day brought fresh challenges, a new crime scene, another set of cryptic clues, and more questions than answers. The pressure from the media was relentless. News outlets provided round-the-clock coverage, dissecting every new development and amplifying the fear that gripped the nation. Pundits speculated endlessly about the killers' motives, their identities, and their next moves. The public, desperate for answers, began to turn their anxiety into anger. Why hadn't the killers been caught? Why did they seem untouchable? But the FBI couldn't afford to be distracted by public opinion. They knew the killers were meticulous, that every move they made was part of a larger plan. The poorly spelled ransom notes weren't just demands, they were messages, clues, and challenges wrapped into one. The death card wasn't just a taunt, it was a declaration of intent. The killers were playing a game, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Even as law enforcement doubled down on their efforts, the killers— and yet, as the investigation progressed, faint traces began to emerge. The seemingly disparate threads of evidence started to weave together, hinting at a larger picture. The killers' methods, their movements, their messages— all of it pointed to a level of planning and organization that was deeply unsettling. They weren't impulsive criminals acting on a whim. They were calculating predators with a purpose. Still, the road ahead was uncertain. Each new clue seemed to raise as many questions as it answered. The killers were still out there, watching, waiting, and planning their next move. The investigators knew they were running out of time. With every passing day, the killers grew bolder, their trail colder, and the stakes higher. Just when the investigation seemed to be reaching a standstill, with more dead ends than answers, a lead emerged that would change everything. The unrelenting pressure, the countless hours spent scouring every possible angle, finally began to pay off in a way that no one could have predicted. It was October 17th, 2002, when a seemingly ordinary tip came from Montgomery, Alabama. But this tip wasn't ordinary at all. It was the first glimmer of real hope. Fingerprints from a liquor store shooting that had taken place months earlier had been run through the system. The results were shocking. The prints matched those of a teenager named Lee Boyd Malvo. Until now, Malvo had been an unknown figure, completely off the radar. But his connection to John Allen Muhammad, a Gulf War veteran already on law enforcement's radar for his erratic behavior and past offenses, immediately caught the attention of investigators. The tension in the investigation room was palpable. After weeks of chasing shadows, they finally had a name, a concrete lead to work with. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but with every answer came more troubling questions. How were these two individuals connected? Why had they targeted so many seemingly random victims? And, most importantly, where were they now? As law enforcement agencies across multiple states worked around the clock, the sense of urgency grew by the hour. The clock was ticking, and the killers, whoever they were, showed no signs of stopping. But now, armed with this critical information, the search intensified. Investigators knew they were closer than ever to unraveling the mystery behind the DC sniper attacks. The public didn't know it yet, but the long, terrifying chapter was finally approaching its end. Then, on October 24th, a breakthrough came that would bring everything to a head. A truck driver, stopping at a rest area along Interstate 70 in Maryland, spotted something suspicious. An old blue Chevrolet Caprice. It was a car that fit the description of the vehicle law enforcement had been on the lookout for, but so far had failed to track down. The driver, noticing the car's occupant sleeping inside, quickly reported the sighting. The alert was made, and within minutes the FBI and local police mobilized, their target finally in sight. The rest area was quietly surrounded, authorities moving with precision and care. The killers had evaded capture for weeks, but there would be no escaping this time. The vehicle was approached cautiously, guns drawn, ready for any sudden movement. But inside, they found nothing but silence. John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo were sound asleep, oblivious to the fact that their reign of terror had come to an abrupt end. Beside them, a Bushmaster .223 caliber rifle lay within arm's reach, the very weapon that had been used to wreak havoc and claim so many innocent lives. The moment was surreal, almost anticlimactic, considering the chaos these men had unleashed. Yet for law enforcement, it was a moment of triumph and relief. The nightmare was over. The terror that had paralyzed an entire region, casting fear over daily life, had been brought to a close in the most unassuming way. While the perpetrator, but as the dust settled and the immediate threat had passed, new and chilling questions began to surface. How had these two individuals, a seasoned military veteran and a teenager, come together to form such a deadly partnership? What motivated them to carry out such a senseless campaign of violence? What drove them to toy with the authorities for so long? The answers, though elusive at first, would soon start to unravel. This was not just the end of the manhunt, it was the beginning of a deeper investigation into the minds and motives of John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo. And their story was one of manipulation, control, and an ideology twisted into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. The capture of John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo was just the beginning of understanding the true horror that lay behind their actions. For law enforcement, the public, and even seasoned criminal profilers, it became immediately clear that these two were not typical criminals. Their relationship, their motives, and the methodical nature of their crimes pointed to something far more complex and insidious than a random killing spree. As investigators began to peel back the layers of this disturbing case, they realized that the bond between Muhammad and Malvo was unlike anything they had encountered before. Muhammad, a man in his early 40s, was not only the leader of this murderous duo, he was a manipulator, a master of control. In many ways, Lee Boyd Malvo, just 17 years old, was both a partner and a victim in Muhammad's twisted game. Muhammad had groomed him, shaped him, and molded him into a tool for his violent vision of chaos. But how did this happen? How did a teenage boy from Jamaica become the willing accomplice to a man with such deadly intent? The story begins years earlier, when Malvo first crossed paths with Muhammad. Malvo, born into a life of hardship, had endured a fractured childhood filled with instability. His early years were marked by an absent father and a mother who struggled to provide for him. It was during this vulnerable period that Malvo entered Malvo's life, promising him guidance, protection, and a sense of belonging that Malvo had never known. Malvo had never known. Muhammad, a Gulf War veteran with a troubled past of his own, took Malvo under his wing, positioning himself as a father figure. But beneath this guise of mentorship, Muhammad had far darker plans. By the time the two began their deadly rampage, Malvo was no longer just a lost teenager looking for direction. He had become fully indoctrinated into Muhammad's violent worldview. Their bond was cemented not through love or loyalty, but through manipulation and psychological control. Muhammad had convinced Malvo that they were on a mission to upend society, to strike fear into the hearts of ordinary people, and bring the world to its knees. And Malvo, desperate for purpose, followed him without question. The DC sniper attacks were not an impulsive act of violence, but part of a meticulously crafted plan, a plan that went far beyond what the public knew. Muhammad's ultimate goal wasn't simply to kill random strangers. He had grander, more sinister designs. Behind the seemingly random shootings was a plot for financial extortion. Muhammad demanded millions of dollars in exchange for an end to the terror. But even that was only part of his larger scheme. Muhammad's personal life had been crumbling long before the attacks began. He had lost custody of his children after a bitter divorce, and this had been a devastating blow to his fragile psyche. Consumed by rage, he had hatched a plan to kill his ex-wife, a plan that involved using the sniper attacks as a smokescreen. In Muhammad's twisted logic, he believed that by orchestrating a series of high-profile murders, he could draw attention away from his true target, his former spouse. If she became just another victim in a series of random killings, no one would ever suspect that it was a premeditated act of revenge. As the investigation into the pair's backgrounds progressed, it became increasingly clear that Muhammad had meticulously chosen Malvo for this role. Muhammad knew that Malvo, young and impressionable, was someone he could manipulate with ease. He had exploited Malvo's need for guidance, for belonging, and for approval, twisting these desires into a weapon as deadly as the rifle they used in their attacks. The sheer coldness of Malvo's actions, carried out with a lack of remorse, left many wondering how much of this was his own doing and how much was the result of Muhammad's influence. In interviews following their capture, Malvo seemed almost disconnected from the magnitude of what he had done, as if the weight of the lives he had taken had not yet sunk in. It was this chilling detachment that made the pair all the more terrifying. The unmasking of John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo revealed more than just their identities. It exposed a deeply disturbing dynamic of control and manipulation. It was no longer just a story of a man and a boy, but a story of how one person could warp another's sense of morality and humanity to the point where murder became just another task to complete. As the full scope of their plan came to light, the nation was left grappling with the unsettling realization that this could have gone on for much longer, with far more lives lost had it not been for the timely breakthrough. But even as Muhammad and Malvo sat in custody, the fear and uncertainty they had instilled in the public remained. People still questioned how two individuals, so different in age and background, could come together and create such a lethal force. And as investigators continued to unravel their story, the answers that emerged were as haunting as the crimes themselves. The story of John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo was far from over. Their trial would reveal even more shocking details about their relationship, their motives, and the psychological toll their actions had taken, not just on their victims and their families, but on the entire nation. But for now, the focus remained on one burning question. What drove these two individuals to commit such unspeakable acts of violence, and how had they managed to evade capture for so long? The trial of John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo began with a sense of inevitability. The nation had watched in horror as their crimes unfolded in real time, and now, as the court proceedings commenced, it seemed that justice was finally within reach. But as the details of the case were laid bare before the jury, the public came to realize just how deeply disturbing and tragic this story truly was. Edmund Boyd, Muhammad, the mastermind behind the attacks, showed little emotion as the prosecution presented the mountain of evidence against him. The ballistic reports, the eyewitness testimonies, and the chilling confessions from Malvo painted a damning picture of a man who had orchestrated a campaign of terror with cold, calculated precision. His defense team attempted to highlight his troubled past, his experience in the Gulf War, and the emotional scars left by his bitter custody battle. But none of that could explain away the horrors he had unleashed. For Lee Boyd Malvo, the situation was more complicated. As a minor at the time of the killings, his fate rested on the question of whether he had been fully responsible for his actions, or if he had been manipulated and coerced by Muhammad. Malvo's defense portrayed him as a victim, an impressionable young man who had been groomed by Muhammad to carry out the killings without fully understanding the gravity of what he was doing. The courtroom grappled with difficult questions. Could a 17-year-old be held fully accountable for such heinous acts? Or was Malvo just another casualty of Muhammad's twisted mind? In the end, the court delivered its verdict. Muhammad, whose role as the mastermind and executioner was undeniable, was sentenced to death. He would spend the next 7 years on death row, awaiting his final day. His execution, carried out on November 10, 2009, brought a sense of closure to many of the victims' families, though the emotional scars of the tragedy would never truly heal. For Malvo, the sentence was different. Because of his age, the court spared him from the death penalty. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even after the trial, questions lingered about whether Malvo had been fully aware of the magnitude of his actions. In later years, Malvo would reflect on the crimes, expressing regret for his involvement. But for the families of the victims, those apologies offered little solace. As time passed, the legacy of the DC sniper attacks continued to reverberate across the country. The weeks of terror in 2002 had left deep psychological wounds, not just for those directly affected by the killings, but for an entire nation that had been gripped by fear. Schools had gone on lockdown, neighborhoods had emptied, and millions of Americans had watched the news each night with bated breath, hoping that the killers would be caught before they could strike again. Yet, even as the immediate threat faded with the arrests of Muhammad and Malvo, the emotional toll of those harrowing weeks lingered. Families who had lost loved ones in the attacks faced a future filled with grief and unanswered questions. For them, the trial and the sentencing of the killers provided a form of justice, but it could never fully heal the pain of losing a mother, a father, a sibling, or a friend. In the years since the sniper attacks, debates have persisted about juvenile sentencing, especially in cases as severe as Malvo's. Should someone so young be condemned to a life behind bars without the possibility of redemption? Could Malvo's actions be entirely attributed to Muhammad's influence, or had he made the conscious choice to participate in the killings? These are questions that, even today, stir passionate debate among legal scholars, psychologists, and the general public. And yet, the deeper lessons of the DC sniper case go beyond questions of justice. The attacks serve as a chilling reminder of the fragility of life, the randomness with which violence can strike, and the way that fear can permeate every aspect of society. For 3 weeks, ordinary people going about their daily routines, pumping gas, shopping, walking to school, had become targets in a deadly game, their lives stolen without warning. The victims, whose names should never be forgotten, became unwilling participants in a nightmare that no one could have predicted. But there is also another legacy left behind by those dark weeks in 2002, a legacy of resilience. In the face of terror, law enforcement agencies worked tirelessly to track down the killers, coordinating across jurisdictions, pooling their resources, and ultimately bringing Muhammad and Malvo to justice. The investigators involved in the case faced immense pressure, knowing that each passing day could bring more death. But they persevered. Their efforts serve as a testament to the dedication of those who work to protect the public, often at great personal cost. As we reflect on the DC sniper attacks, we are reminded of the delicate balance between justice and mercy, and the importance of safeguarding our communities from those who seek to do harm. We are reminded of the lives lost, the families forever changed, and the courage of those who stood in the face of fear. The story of John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo is a tragic one, filled with pain and loss, but also with lessons that must not be forgotten. It forces us to confront the darker aspects of human nature, to question how individuals can be driven to commit such senseless acts of violence, and to consider what we, as a society, can do to prevent such horrors from happening again. If you believe that children should never be manipulated into a life of violence, and that justice should be served for those who harm the innocent, subscribe to this channel. Only those who believe in defending the defenseless will join us. Together, we can stand against the darkness.